Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at Morphy's with a Colt manufactured model of 1915 Vickers gun. And this is one of the US Army's standard heavy machine guns during World War I. It was in fact formally adopted as the US standard heavy machine gun in 1915, hence its name. But there were kind of some production hiccups, and we didn't really get nearly as many of them as you would think we would have, given that the gun was formally adopted 2 years before the US entered World War I, and the fact that we had a pretty good idea that World War I was going on, because it was like going on when we adopted this gun. So the backstory here is that the US actually did some early testing on a lightweight Vickers gun in 1908, and then did more thorough, serious testing in 1913 and 1914. And the officers who tested these things came back with glowing reviews, which is not surprising considering the other guns that were available at the time. The previous US heavy machine gun had been the model of 1904 Maxim gun, which weighed almost twice as much as the what would eventually be adopted as the Vickers gun. So 1913, 1914, the US does some significant testing. They really like the gun. It's recommended for adoption in 1914, and it's formally adopted in 1915. And an order is placed for 125 guns from the Colt company. Now, there is a contract for licensed production that's set up with Vickers. Vickers, of course, is busy making as many of these as they can for the British war effort, or they will be shortly. And so the idea is that these will be manufactured in the United States by Colt. So there's a royalty setup, licensing, that's all taken care of. Interestingly, the original purchase price for that first 125 guns, in 1915 dollars, $1,893, rounding up to the nearest dollar. This was a just incredibly expensive gun. That's 1915 dollars. Like, even as a registered machine gun today, this is actually less expensive than it was when the US government bought it, or probably will be, expecting what something like this will sell for. That's really remarkable, just how incredibly expensive these guns were when they were first purchased. At any rate, Colt was busy doing a lot of firearms manufacturing in 1915. There was, of course, a big war going on, and all of the combatants were interested in finding foreign contractors to build guns for them. And Colt ended up accepting this 125-gun piddly little contract from the US. It also accepted a contract for 6,000 Vickers guns for the UK, and one for 10,000 guns for the Russian Empire. Ultimately, it would produce some of the Russian guns, which then got sidetracked by the Russian Revolution. It would completely default on the British order. The US, in December of 1916, even though it had by that point received a grand total of 0 Colt Vickers guns, placed a follow-up order for another 4,000. That order took some time to actually place. There was some dithering back and forth in the US Ordnance Department over what machine guns do we need? Do we really need machine guns? Yes, we need them, but finally they placed another order for 4,000. Colt is now looking at 20,000 guns worth of back order that it hasn't even started to produce. So before we talk about when they finally actually did get into production, let's go ahead and take a look around this gun, and I'll point out some of the elements that differentiate this from a standard British production Vickers gun, because there are a couple, and they make the US gun a unique and desirable collector's piece today. The most distinctive element of the American Vickers gun is the rear sight. This is a fairly complicated rear sight. This is the same style that was used on the 1909 Benet Mercier light machine guns, as well as on the Browning 1917 heavy machine guns. So we have a knob here that does windage, and it actually, as you can see, pivots the entire rear sight assembly side to side. This is graduated up to 2,600 yards. There are also metric sights that were used. They will be marked meters, and they go to 2,400 meters. With metric graduations instead of yards. It's interesting to take a look at this. The actual rear sight aperture, you have your choice of 5 separate apertures, 4 different apertures, and a rear sight notch there, should you want it. There's also a notch right there, and you've got your standard sort of battle sight notch right there. It's a complicated and expensive rear sight. one of the reasons that I mention it first is that it's the most visually distinctive element that can set a gun apart as an American, as a Colt gun in, say, a photograph. This is very easily distinguished from the standard British, just long rib with a rear sight on it. Now, of course, I don't think I mentioned this, but these guns are chambered for 30-06, as that was the standard American cartridge. The Vickers is a fairly easy gun to convert from caliber to caliber, especially at the factory, so there was no problem for Colt to configure this for 30-06. And so the feed blocks, the barrels, and the extractors on the bolts, which we can pull out here. That guy, these are all set up for 30-06, and they are interchangeable in other Vickers guns. So caliber converting the American guns to 303 to 8mm to 54 rimmed is all fairly simple, and 30-06 parts can go into British Vickers guns as well. One of the nice things about a gun that was designed to be easy to change calibers in. Up here at the muzzle, we have a slightly distinctive version of Muzzle Booster. The British guns had an armored section at the front and were more filled in here around the periphery. The American version is skeletonized, as you see here, similar to what was on the US 1904 pattern Maxim guns. And there you have a view down the front of that Muzzle Booster. The Colt Vickers all have that cool corrugated steel barrel jacket. That was done, of course, to reduce the thickness required for the water jacket, but still give it the rigidity and strength necessary to sustain rough handling. On a purely aesthetic note, the grip handles on the Colt Vickers guns are made of gutta percha instead of wood. You can distinguish this in a photograph because the checkering is actually not continuous. There's a little band here that's smooth in the middle. So if you know what to look for, that jumps out pretty well. There are also a few differences in the Colt-produced tripods compared to the British ones, although this is fundamentally just a copy of the British Mark IV tripod. By the way, the paint that is on this one, I am about 98% sure is someone's post-war addition to make it look cool. That was not standard, and this isn't cast into the brass bits of the tripod here, it's just painted on. At any rate, this really thick, large windage adjustment or elevation adjustment knob, that is distinctive to the Colt guns and only produced by Colt. And then the rear foot of the Colt tripod is substantially larger to give a little bit better purchase into the ground. So on the British tripods, all three of the feet have this sort of smaller round pattern. For Colt, the front two are small and the rear one is large. And the Colt tripods all have data plates on them with a serial number and manufacturer marks. So there is also this leather strap wrapped around the gun here that's secured in place by the data plate, and that strap is there so that when the tripod is folded up, you can strap all three legs together so that they don't, flop around. The only markings you will find on the gun itself are actually up at the front of the barrel jacket. Contrary to what we might expect today, there's nothing on the back end of the gun on the receiver or the side plates. Instead, we have Vickers machine gun. This one, unfortunately, has been worn down and then refinished, so some of the markings are not particularly visible anymore. But it would have said model of 1915, Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, Hartford, Connecticut. We have our serial number right there, which in this case on this gun originally was 2321. And then this is a 1917 inspection date, and JMC was the officer, the initials of the officer who inspected and approved this gun for service. They will all say model of 1915. That 1917 inspection date tells you when the gun was actually produced. Maybe it goes without saying, but I should reiterate it here, that mechanically this is a Vickers gun, fundamentally, and the internals are all interchangeable with standard Vickers gun, British Vickers gun production, despite the difference in some of these external features. So operates just like a Vickers gun, shoots like a Vickers gun, just happens to be chambered for 30-06 and used by the American Expeditionary Force. The first actual deliveries to the US military took place in August of 1917. It would take a couple more months until October of 1917 before the first batch of guns was actually shipped over to Europe for the AEF. Due to some of these delays, the first 12 US divisions to go to France were equipped with French Model 1914 Hotchkiss guns. That, by the way, is 192 guns per U.S. division, so about 2,000 Hotchkiss guns for the first group. The next 10 divisions that were sent over were able to be equipped with Vickers guns. And by the middle of 1918, Colt had gotten to the point where they were able to produce about 50 guns per day, which means 1,300 per month production totals. That was the goal that they had set. They finally did get there in 1918. The plan was, after those next 10 divisions with Vickers guns, they were going to equip the next couple of divisions with Browning guns. The Browning 1917 was already in development, and they knew that this was going to be a better gun than the Vickers. Certainly a lot less expensive gun. However, there were production delays getting Browning guns over, and so there were a couple more divisions that were outfitted with Vickers guns. Production ended in September of 1918 because at that point, Browning production had come up to speed sufficient to take care of all future anticipated U.S. need, and of course the war would end just 2 months later. Once in theater, the plan was they were actually going to convert all of the Colt Vickers guns into aircraft use and swap them out with the infantry for Browning guns. There were a grand total of 12,125 of these guys produced. While they were over in the war, about 1,000 of them were lost on the battlefield, and another 2,888 were converted into air service guns, some in .6, some in 11 millimeter. I have a separate video about the aircraft Vickers. If you're interested in what we did to put these on airplanes, you can check out that video. I'll link to it at the end of this one. So this left the US with about 8,000 1915 model Vickers guns after the end of World War I. They would hang around US inventory as reserves until World War II. Early on in World War II, we would send about 500 of them to the Dutch East Indies and a couple hundred of them to the Philippines. All of those were very happily captured and put back into service by the Japanese. Oops. And almost all of the remaining guns in U.S. inventory, about 7,000, were shipped over to Britain as part of Lend-Lease, where they were set up for potential use to defend against a German invasion, which ultimately never happened. So at the end of World War II, the British offered to send them back, but by U.S. standards, they were already obsolete guns, so the U.S. declined to get them back, and they were, alas, virtually all cut up and thrown into the North Sea. So they remain a very scarce gun today, distinctive for those elements that you took a look at, and pretty interesting as one of the early machine guns that was formally adopted and used by the U.S. Army in World War I. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this look at a really beautiful example of a Colt 1915 pattern Vickers gun. Thanks for watching.